Now, I should tell you that most of you probably know EJ's a fellow with Brookings Institute. He's a columnist with the Washington Post. He holds a professorship at Georgetown. He's written 3 books. He's co-edited 3 books. He went to Harvard. He went to Oxford. Bottom line, he's really smart. And he's a great writer. And so I'm so glad he can talk with us about faith and politics. Thank you so much for coming. He's going to talk for about half an hour and then do questions and answers. I invite you all to reception afterwards where you'll be having books.
Thank you. That was so sweet. That was so much nicer than the intro I got recently when I gave a talk on politics where the guy said, and now for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. So thank you very much for that. So good to see so many really dear friends. I won't say old because you don't want to use that word, but, you know, Roberto and Marty and Richard. You know, my interest in religion and politics goes back, well, as I say in the book, really all the way since I was a kid. And, you know, at our house, at our dinner table at home, we broke the rules. 2 subjects we discussed all the time were religion and politics. But Richard Reeves can testify to this because when I was about 19 or 20 years old, another student called Doug Schoen and a professor whom you now see on CNN called Bill Schneider, we were interested in figuring out the Jewish vote in New York and wanted to see whether sort of some of the racial conflict of, if you remember, some of you may remember the New York City teacher strike, and there were all kinds of other things, had pushed some Jews to the right. And it was the 1973 Democratic primary was the perfect test case because you never had a ballot that had everything controlled on it because you had a Puerto Rican very liberal candidate called Herman Medillo, a traditional liberal called Al Blumenthal, a machine Democrat called Abe Beam, and a right-wing Democrat cop candidate called Mario Biaggi. And who agreed to give us the money for this but Richard Reeves and New York Magazine. And so we organized. I don't think we had any idea what we were doing, but the poll was great, actually. We did this enormous poll in New York City. What?
The poll was better than
but the results were interesting. You got a lot of good pieces out of that poll. And I actually wrote some of my PhD thesis off that poll, so it did more than its service. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sold out. And, you know, I worry a lot about sort of the way in which religion might be used in politics. There's the famous story of the political consultant who said to his candidate, you can fool some of the people all of the time, and those are the ones you should concentrate on. And I worry that this is the sort of subject where politicians might do that. You know, after the 2004 election, an awful lot of Democrats discovered God in the exit polls. Now, God can be discovered anywhere, so there's nothing wrong with discovering him in the exit polls, but one worries about what the motivations might be for people starting to quote scripture, starting to describe how religious they are, and that sort of thing. And we're just down the road from Hollywood, and all of you know that famous line from Hollywood that all you need is sincerity, and if you can fake that, you can do anything. And as I say explicitly in the book, faking religious belief is one of the worst ideas in the world, I think, particularly for politicians. This book can be seen as one of a number of, if you will, progressive religious books. Paul Begala once said that religious progressive is an oxymoron like jumbo shrimp or compassionate conservative or perhaps journalistic ethics. But in fact, some would say. But in fact, there is an awful lot of change going on in this sphere. I make a lot of different arguments in the book. There's a lot of data on elections. There's quite a bit of reporting on the Vatican. There are I have a long chapter on Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II, drawing on my experiences with Roberto Suro, actually many years ago. But what I want to do is just summarize a few arguments and then highlight a couple of points. My book is an argument about the proper role for religion in public life. It tells liberals, those who have such prejudices, that they need to abandon their prejudices against people of faith. You can remember that famous political cartoon which showed the country divided into 2 parts, Canada and Jesus Land. And, of course, Jesus Land were all the states that voted for President Bush. I thought myself that was unfair to Jesus to characterize him that way. But also it reflected this prejudice that some liberals have. The finest thing about liberalism has been its opposition to prejudice, to anti-Semitism, to racism, to sexism, prejudice against gays and lesbians. Liberals ought not to have prejudices against people of faith. But it also tells conservatives, and this I'll get to this in more detail, that it's a big mistake to narrow religion's writ to only subjects such as gay marriage and abortion. I once had a debate with Ralph Reed where I said, Ralph, I will always defend your right to base your political views on your religious beliefs, since in many ways I became a liberal because I am a Christian. But I said, you have to find me in the New Testament where Jesus supported a cut in the capital gains tax. I just cannot find it in my New Testament. So I have things to say to liberals and conservative. It's an argument that the religious winds are changing in politics and that the era of the religious right is over. It argues that charity is good, but justice is better. I recently ran across a wonderful quotation from Dom Helder Camara, who was a radical Roman Catholic bishop in Brazil many years ago, and he said, when I gave food to the poor, they called me a saint. When I asked why there were so many poor, they called me a communist. And, you know, my friend Jim Wallace has a famous story he likes to tell about the person who rescues people drowning in a river. And he says it's good to rescue people drowning in the river, but if people keep floating by, it just might be useful to go upstream and see who is throwing people into the river or why they might be falling in. It insists that we have allowed politics to create a false morality, a false public morality that pits personal responsibility against social responsibility when, in fact, we need both, and indeed both complement each other. This is one of the only books on religion that you will ever read, particularly a pro-religion book, that begins with a joke. It's one of my favorite jokes, and Dionne has probably heard me tell it because I've told it so often, and I actually promised my friends that once I put it in the book I'd stop telling it, but the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. And I also think that the joke tells us a lot about this subject. It's a story told, I first heard this from a bishop in Albany, New York about 25 years ago. It's the story of Mrs. O'Reilly and her son was dutifully taking her to the polls on Election Day. Mrs. O'Reilly had always voted straight Democratic. Her son, a successful member of the upper middle class, had become an independent, though really he voted Republican most of the time. As was their routine, the son asked his mother how she was going to vote, and the mother said, as always, straight Democratic. The exasperated son replied, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you would vote against him. And Mrs. O'Reilly snapped back, oh, hush, why should he change his party after all these years?